So let me tell you a story that's very related to that attempt at humor.
Oh, he did say that. He did say that. I was like, what are you talking about? This music is wonderful. Well, welcome. A special welcome to my fellow misfit, Tim Stevens, and a really, really special welcome to our special guest for the week, Matt Abrahams. Now, as you may know, is an author, a Stanford lecturer. He is a keynote speaker. He is really, really good at helping people learn to talk better. But before we get into that, let's do some open source comedy. And Tim, you're going to take us off first.
What do Stanford and UCLA graduates have in common?
Uh-oh, be careful. Be careful. They both don't like USC.
They both applied to Stanford.
Uh-huh. Some of my best friends are from UCLA. I almost went there myself. All right.
I had to poke at you.
All
right. I don't know if I told you this the other day. I was working with a woman who had asked me for help on her computer. She's an older lady. She was getting into a new job after years of retirement. Her son had ended up moving back in with her and had chewed through all of her retirement savings. And she was back in the workforce after 15 years in retirement. She started asking questions that were really basic, like, how do I connect to the VPN? What is the cloud? I've never used Exchange. So I did what any tech would do. I planted porn on her computer and called HR. I don't have time for all that. When I got home, my mom was really mad at me. All right. And Matt.
So let me tell you a story that's very related to that attempt at humor, which was one of my first jobs was working for a software company that you look to be of the similar vintage to me. So this is when things were going from dumb terminals to like PCs.
Yes.
So part of this software ran on PCs, and a lot of these bank tellers had only used dumb terminals. And we set up their PCs, and we're going to show them how our software worked. And I stepped away to go help somebody else. I came back, and the mouse was gone from this woman's computer. And I'm like, where's the mouse? And she goes, oh, you mean this thing? She had put it on the floor, and she was tapping on it because she said it was like a sewing machine pedal. She was an older woman. Wow. And so she thought that's how it worked. And I in my most polite and anyway, she broke the damn thing because she was pushing so hard on it. And then she wanted to know why we called it a mouse. Anyway, so your story reminded me of that. And my story, while not funny, is funnier than yours was, Jerry. So.
Hey,
love it.
Ouch.
Love it.
Yeah, you're speaking Tim's language right now, man. All right.
He wrote me and told me he'd ask me the easier questions if I made fun of you. So we're going.
Gotcha, Jerry.
That's awesome. That is awesome. All right. Well, like I said, we are here with Matt Abrahams, obviously. He is the author of the book, Speaking Up Without Freaking Out. He's also the host of the podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smarter, which I do love and I listen to fairly consistently. And he's a Stanford lecturer. He's a keynote speaker, and he has a new book coming out called Think Faster, Talk Smarter. And that's what we're going to talk about today is the new book. Now, in a sort of a general overview, I was wondering, did it go from kind of the podcast title is essentially Think Fast, Talk Smart, right? So did it go from, but you've been doing that for a while. So did it go from your learnings in that to, I'm going to construct this book? Or was it, I like the idea of this book and I'm going to talk through this podcast and learn more as I go?
So it's more the former than the latter.
Okay.
So what it demonstrates is I'm not that creative with names. For sure. So Think Fast, Talk Smart has been something I've been talking about for a long time. I did a video with that title probably 9 years ago. And the video has been viewed by many people, and people have told me it was helpful. That led to the creation of the podcast. And we are coming up on our 100th anniversary episode. So we've been doing this a little bit since 2020. And the book is born out of one of the many topics that we talk about on the podcast. The podcast is strictly about communication. The book highlights what I call spontaneous communication, how we communicate in the moment. When somebody asks us questions, asks us for feedback, we make a mistake and we have to fix it, or we're making small talk. So the book is about a subset of the many topics that we've covered on the podcast.
Yeah. And one of the things that I really liked about the way the book is structured is it's got the 6 steps up on the front end, but then you have all of that on the back end that is, hey, here's how you implement it, which I think a lot of the time the books or even podcasts, because your podcast does a good job of that as well, as really sort of giving some structure and some steps for people to take away, as opposed to just, not hopefully not offensively saying just a lecture where, take a bunch of notes and then, assimilate it in your own brain afterwards. So I like that structure of the book, I guess, is just a way around to saying, as I read through it, I thought that was helpful. And I really like the stuff at the end. You have the different structures for the different ways of, hey, when you get caught off guard, here's something that you can fall back on. And I was wondering if you kind of feel like that structure, right, is that a muscle memory thing that people have to build? Or no, it is, kind of once it's ingrained in there, or once you do it once or twice, it's there? Or do you continue to have to build that?
Well, first, thank you. I'm glad you see value in the way we structure the podcast and the way I structure the book. I am somebody who believes that the best way to get better at communication is through doing it. It's one thing to understand the why. It's another thing to understand how to do it. So everything I do has an applied element to it. So thanks for noticing that, because I think it is important, which really gets to the answer to the question you asked, which is communication. Just like any skill, if you're an athlete, if you're a musician, you need to practice. And the more you practice, the better you get at it. But you still need to keep that practice going. I've been doing martial arts for 4 decades now. And while I've gotten proficient in some things, I still have to practice the very early things I learned many decades ago. So you can get more comfortable at communicating in the moment. You can certainly do it with less anxiety, but it is something you have to practice so you can keep that skill sharp and agile when you need to use it.
Yeah. I certainly wish I was better at it at times. I think in IT, we struggle with it quite a bit. I would say it feels like people in IT maybe struggle with it more than other industries, but I don't know. Do you find that to be true? Do you think that's true?
I see issues around spontaneous speaking in all industries. I do think people who are technologists have extra issues that they deal with. There's a desire to give a lot of detail. And many times in spontaneous speaking, people need the headline and not necessarily the details right away. And yet there's this notion that I have to explain things very thoroughly that can actually get in the way of effective communication. My mother has this saying that I love, and it's very helpful on this point. She didn't create it, but I like it just the same. It's tell me the time, don't build me the clock. And what I have found is people who are into technology, IT, science are big clock builders. And that's helpful for when you're building product and services. But when somebody asks you a question or asks for feedback, they often just want the time.
Huh. All right. Well, that's I like the mental picture that gets put in your head for that, right? Like that's very helpful to kind of fall back on as I got to try. I will work on that. Now, you clearly are good at this, but you have said you didn't really start out that way, which I appreciate. I don't know that there are born speakers, but there probably are, but you don't say that you were necessarily born that way, but that it developed through the fact that your last name is Abrahams. So can you give a little of that story?
Yeah, so I certainly believe that everybody can get better at their communication, especially their spontaneous communication. There are some people for whom it is slightly easier easier. I am one of those folks, and it's not because I have any special talent, but as you alluded to, my last name is Abrahams, A-B, all throughout my childhood, even through my college years. I have always gone first. I always know in a classroom where I will sit, first front row near the door, because everybody does things alphabetically. So when the teacher would call on people alphabetically, I always went first. So I was always the one doing it spontaneously. And my friends would thank me, because by the time it got to my friends who were in the middle of the alphabet, they had some time to think about it. They saw what was working, what wasn't working. And so for me, it was a learned skill out of just experience. Now that I say that with tongue in cheek. I mean, I have absolutely had to work on my communication, and I have helped people whose names started the early part of the alphabet all the way through the end of the alphabet. But repetition is, the only way you get good at communication is the same way you get good at any skill. It's three things: repetition, reflection, and feedback. I certainly, based on my last name, got lots of repetition. You do have to reflect. There's that definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. We need in our communication to reflect what's working, what's not working. And then finally, you need to seek out people who can give you guidance and feedback. We are not the best observers of our own communication. We need to get others outside of us telling us what's working and what's not working. So yes, I benefited from having a last name that comes early in the alphabet, but I did have to work on it for many years as well.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit now about in the book, it is the 6-step Talk Smarter method. And I think for our listeners who are generally IT individuals, I really hope that this is the meat. And obviously, buy the book, listen to the podcast, because it's all going to be very helpful to them and to you listeners as you are working on these skills. But could you give us kind of that would give us the walkthrough of the 6 steps?
Absolutely. So I've created over the years a 6-step methodology. This methodology was really born out of a need that Stanford University had. I teach at the graduate school. And the deans came to me several years ago and said, we need help. And the issue is this: our very bright students are choking. They're not able to answer cold calls. Many of your listeners will remember the professor points at you and says, what do you think? And you have to respond on the spot. And these students knew the answer. They're very smart, but they just could not get a good answer out because of their anxiety, because of other issues. So I developed this methodology as a result of that. And it has 6 steps. The first 4 steps are all lumped together under this notion of mindset. It's how we have to change our mindset. And then the last 2 steps are really about messaging. So I'll very quickly run through them, and I'm happy to drill down on any of these. The first of the 6 steps, first of the 4 mindset steps, has to do with anxiety. Anxiety looms large in all of our communication, but especially when we're put on the spot. Most people get nervous speaking, period, but especially in impromptu situations. The second step has us getting out of our own way. Many of us, when we communicate, we want to do it right. We want to be perfect at what we're saying. And that striving for perfection gets in the way of actually being able to do it well at all. That's what was happening to the MBA students. So I often say, strive for connection over perfection. And then step 3 is about reframing these situations. Many of us see spontaneous speaking as a threat, as a challenge. Imagine in a job interview where your boss comes up to you and says, I have a few questions for you. Most of us don't go, oh, that's great, I'm so excited. We think, oh no, I have to defend myself. I have to be on my game. This is a challenge for me. Yet if we flip the way we see these and see these as actually opportunities where we can actually extend, expand, collaborate with our ideas, all of a sudden it changes the whole dynamic. And then the final step under mindset is listening. And both of you might be saying, wait a minute, you're talking about speaking in the moment, but in order to get the right response, you need to make sure that you're listening well. And I'll give you an example. Jerry, imagine Tim comes out of a meeting and he asks you for feedback. He goes, hey, what do you think? How'd that go? And you might list a whole bunch of reasons that it didn't go well, why things could have been better, what you two should do different next time. But had you really listened, you might have noticed that Tim came out of the back door, not the front door. You might have noticed that Tim, when he asked you the question, was staring out the window and didn't have his normal gregarious voice. you might have come to realize, had you listened better, that what Tim was asking for was not feedback, but was support. He didn't feel good about how that meeting went. And what you did was exactly the wrong thing. By layering on all these things that he should have done, you did exactly the opposite of what he needed. So we have to listen well to make sure whatever our response is a good one. So that's mindset. I know I'm talking a lot. Let me get through the last two quickly. The last two steps are messaging. I am a huge fan of structure. When we communicate, what is so important is to structure it. Now, many people in IT, many engineers who are programmers, you understand the value of structure. Structure helps in many ways. If you're a coder, it makes it more concise and clear. It makes it repeatable. If you're doing IT work, having structure to the process, very important. You can run QA on it. It's reliable. You can repeat it. Structure can do the same things in communication. So having a structure to your message really matters. And then the final step is what I call the F word of communication. It's not that naughty one that, Jerry, you just thought of. I saw you smile. It has to do with focus, not that other thing. Many of us, when we speak, we say too much. We're discovering what we want to say as we're saying it. And that means we're rambling on and on. So we need to be concise and clear. So 6 steps, 4 about mindset, 2 about messaging. And with practice, and like you said in the book, I give lots of ways to practice it as you're going along. This methodology can help people be more comfortable and confident speaking spontaneously.
So thank you. Thank you for going into that detail. And no, you're not talking too much. I love it. I do want to ask, so part of what we do is we do stand-up comedy, right? And so part of the fun here is that we get into that. But one of the keys to stand-up comedy is that connection and trying to make a connection with the audience really very early on in your set. And if you don't make that connection, then it's difficult to ring true to the audience and to find that common ground. So can you give a little bit, because stand-up comedy, you could argue, is spontaneous, is not spontaneous. Obviously we practice it a lot before we ever do it. Clearly, my older woman needing help needs some additional practice. But
I think a little more practice, but that's good.
but with that said, what would you call like that connection? What are some additional tips on building that connection quickly in that type of environment?
Excellent question. So in writing the book, I consulted a lot of improv experts. I'm a huge fan of improvisation. I have learned a lot of improv from people like Patricia Ryan Madsen, Adam Tobin, Dan Klein. These are people who've been doing it for years. I am not necessarily great at improv, but I do enjoy it. And the principles of improv can really help you speak in the moment. A lot of people think of improv as about being funny. It's not. It's about thinking quickly on your feet and giving yourself permission to do so. I also, for the book, interviewed some stand-up comedians, most notably somebody named Trevor Wallace. And it was really fascinating to learn how he prepares for these situations. And I went to him to speak particularly about hecklers, because if you think about it, that's a super challenging situation that arises a lot for stand-up comedians. And I've always been fascinated by how well most comedians handle hecklers. So I've done a lot about stand-up comedy and thinking about it and how it relates. And you're right, most stand-up comedians prepare a lot. They practice a lot over and over again. Yet they're doing that practice to prepare themselves to be in the moment and spontaneous to what the audience does with their material. So it's one of these really nice examples of how you prepare to be spontaneous, which sounds a little opposed, but in fact, it works a lot. How do you engage an audience, which was your big question. And I took a long time to get to this. A lot of engagement has to be with being present and noticing what's going on. There are really 3 ways to engage an audience. One is physically, to get them to do something physical with you. You know, a good stand-up comedian is a very physical stand-up comedian. Think of Chris Rock, for example. He doesn't just stand behind a mic and tell jokes. He's moving all the time. He's being very descriptive. He's getting the audience involved in a physical manner. Another way to get your audience involved is mentally. Ask them questions, ask them to envision, use analogies. I mean, some of the best humor is comparing things to things that typically you don't think get compared, right? And so that engages people. And then finally, use language. Language is a great way to engage people. Great comedians play with language. One of my all-time favorite comedians is George Carlin, and his ability to play with language, I think, is just fantastic. So those are ways that you can engage the audience. Notice what's happening in the moment and comment on it. Robin Williams is another favorite of mine. I had the pleasure of seeing him live once, and I kid you not, my stomach hurt for 3 days, and I think I heard like half the jokes. I was so busy laughing. He played this big stadium near where I live, but he's all about what's happening in the moment, right? What happens in the moment, so those are the ways I think we engage our audience. And the cool thing for both of you to know is all those skills play out when you're doing a Zoom meeting, when you're talking to your team, when you're talking to your boss. If you can get them physically involved, mentally involved, use language to keep them involved, that's what makes a difference. So everybody can work on the same skills. Not everybody can be funny. Jerry demonstrated that. But with work, I'm sorry, Jerry, I'm just picking on you. Yeah, I'm just picking on you. But no, these are things that can really help in your communication.
Yeah. Matt, and this was one of your older YouTube videos. I think it was about 8 years ago.
Yeah.
Right now it has 32 million views. It's on the Stanford Business YouTube channel. But you talked about the physical reaction to being nervous before you get on a stage and you speak in front of a group, and that fight or flight response that comes into effect. And all of these things that you explain were pretty traumatic when I listened to it. I thought it was, but I love that because it's the science behind why am I not breathing right now? Why is my blood pressure up? Why am I sweating and things like that? So I love that. And then you went into, here are some of the things that you can do to combat that physical reaction so you can speak clearly. And I'd love to hear about that more. But one of the things that I'm interested in, because I've picked this up, and I don't know if this is doctrine, but I've just noticed it. I've done some Toastmasters in the past, is that I notice when anybody gets on stage or in front of a group, regardless of how polished they are, there's a period between, I'd say, 15 and 20 seconds, sometimes more, where you can sense the nervousness, regardless of how well and how long they've been doing that. And then over time, it goes away and they're more relaxed. They're animated. They're confident. They're speaking clearly. Is that in the doctrine? Do you know of that? Is that something that's been studied, or is that just the behavior that, is just expected when you get on the stage for 15 to 20 seconds after that?
Yeah. So several things you commented on that I have some thoughts about. So first and foremost, Toastmasters is an amazing organization. I am a former Toastmaster. I literally 2 weeks ago was a presenter at their international conference. I think Toastmasters is a great organization for people hoping to work on their communication skills. As you well know, Tim, they focus both on planned presenting, but they do spontaneous speaking too. They call it table topics.
Yep.
Yeah, it's both. Now, to your point, there is a studied phenomenon, those of us who study this academically, where people are most nervous. Most people are most nervous the minute before speaking and through the first minute of speaking.
Makes sense.
And then people tend to calm down. There are some people who follow a different pattern, but the vast majority of people follow that pattern. And it makes sense, right? It's in that first moment, you're feeling the full response of fight or flight. You're trying to connect with the audience. Very challenging. There are some things you can do to reduce that intensity of that initial moment. I call that going from silence to brilliance, and that can be really, really challenging. So a couple things to do right before you speak that work for many people. My first book, Speaking Up Without Freaking Out, was about 50 techniques that can help people manage anxiety. I don't expect all 50 to work. Everybody's different, but if you can find 3 to 5 that work, that's great. So here are some that work for most people. 1, taking a deep belly breath. If you've ever done yoga or Tai Chi or anything like that, where you really fill your lower abdomen before you speak, and focus on the exhale being longer than the inhale. One of the things I love about hosting a podcast and interviewing just amazingly smart people who study this stuff, I learned from somebody named Andrew Huberman. He's blown up in the podcast world. He's amazing. He talked to me about the exhalation is where all the magic happens in this breathing thing. And so my rule of thumb, or since I'll try to be funny, the rule of lung is that you want your exhale to be twice as long as your inhale. And all you have to do is 2 or 3 of these and it'll calm you down. The other thing you can do is mental. So that's physical. Mentally, remind yourself that you are in service of your audience and you have value to bring to your communication. Many of us get inside our heads and say a lot of negative things right before we start speaking, which makes that anxiety at the beginning worse. We say things like, oh, I should have prepared more, or I'm not going to be as good as Jerry was, or why am I doing this and Tim isn't. I mean, all this negative soundtrack is playing. So if we can remind ourselves that there's a reason you're speaking, people have asked you to speak or want to hear from you because you have value to bring. So if we can say some kind of positive affirmation or mantra, athletes do this all the time. Golfers are notorious for this. When they go to putt, they'll say something like calm or steady, something to just get them focused in the moment that's positive. They don't say, oh, you're going to screw up or better not miss the putt. So we need to do something similar. Now, you can also think about your content to help reduce the anxiety you feel right at the beginning. I coach many people, but I've coached once this very senior leader at Google, and he was very nervous when he started speaking. So what we would do is the beginning of every one of his all hands, where he had thousands of people, is we would distract the audience. Literally, this is what he would say. Good morning, let's watch this video. And he would show a quick YouTube video. People would watch it, and as soon as it was done, he would then facilitate a discussion about the topic of the video that was relevant to his meeting. So he was never presenting. He was either introducing or facilitating, and he felt much better in those positions. So are there things you can do? Take a poll, tell a story, show a startling statistic, have people interact with each other. That takes you out of in that moment, and you can actually do some deep breathing, connect your thoughts, and then that first minute is done, and then you can start moving forward. So there's a lot you can do through what you do physically with deep breathing, what you do mentally with saying something positive to yourself, and in the way you structure that first minute to help you manage that peak in anxiety, Tim, that you rightly pointed out.
Yeah. A couple of things I'm going to comment on is if you're worried about Jerry outperforming you before you get on stage, then maybe you're in the wrong place. Just want to throw that out there. But, Matt, what you shared about that leader from Google showing that video, to me, that's a cheat code right there. Yeah. Showing a video, you get that focus off of you that was just on you. I'm assuming he stepped into the shadows, probably wiped his brow, cleared his breath, took a drink of water, and then stepped in. I think that's awesome. But on the stage as a comedian, I have 5 minutes to get it together, perform, sell it, get a buy-in, connect, and leave the stage, hopefully leaving a good impression and inspiring people. Yeah. So to say that I've got a minute to get warmed up, I've got to shorten that minute. I've got to use some of these techniques that you're discussing. But one thing, and then we've got to move on, is the asking questions. I think you mentioned that in one of your in that same book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I totally get it, and it's not just comedians. Think of a surgeon walking into a surgery that's an emergency surgery. Think of a lot of positions where people have to be in the moment, start right away with confidence. And so asking questions is a great way to do it. Commenting on something in the environment that everybody has a shared experience of, highlighting something in the room that's not you, that gets people connected or engaged. All of those are ways to get something started very quickly, to get you engaged or get involved. And that can help a lot. Something stand-up comedians will do is they'll thank the person who went just before them. And that's a way just to distract the audience from their attention. And, often you follow somebody who introduces you by saying, hey, wasn't that great? Everybody give a round of applause. You've just managed the audience to do something. Their attention is still thinking about the other person, and then you can jump in. So that's a great way to ignite, accelerate that.